This isn't in the books, but it should be. If you like what I do here, consider subscribing. Low light, open mind, silence within. In the cold mountains of South America, a leaf grew that would rewrite the rules of power. For centuries, it belonged to rituals, to survival, to communities who understood its strength without weaponizing it. But when science met greed, when laboratories met ambition, when corporations met silence, that leaf became something else entirely. It became medicine sold in amber bottles. It became tonics advertised on city walls. It became the fuel for wars, the currency of empires, the foundation of cartels more powerful than governments. This isn't a story about a drug. It's a story about how truth gets erased when profit demands it. How entire systems, medical, financial, political, chose complicity over honesty. How a plant crossed oceans and became an empire built on bodies no one wanted to count. The official version will tell you cocaine was a problem that emerged from the streets. But the real story, it started in boardrooms, in laboratories, in diplomatic halls where decisions were made that would collapse nations and reshape the world. What you're about to hear has been deliberately hidden, classified, silenced by those who benefited most from keeping you in the dark. From the Andean villages where it began to the jungle labs where it was perfected. From the banks that laundered billions to the offices where politicians made deals they'd never admit. This is the history they don't want you to know. The history of how a white powder became the most successful operation in modern crime. The history of how we got here. And it all started with a leaf no one thought could change the world. High in the Andean mountain ranges, where snow fell soft over isolated villages and the air thinned with every step, the coca leaf was more than medicine. It was survival. Native peoples chewed it to endure hunger, cold, exhaustion that bent spines and hollowed eyes. For centuries, coca belonged to rituals, to shamans, to communities who understood its power without abusing it. But when European colonizers arrived in the 16th century, they didn't see tradition. They saw opportunity. And the truth about what happened next has been carefully erased from most history books. The conquistadors watched the indigenous people work impossible hours in silver mines, sustained only by handfuls of green leaves. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Men who should have collapsed kept moving, kept digging, kept bleeding the earth dry. So the colonizers didn't ban coca. They systematized it. They turned an ancient practice into an economic operation, forcing workers to consume more so they could extract more. The leaf that once healed became a tool of exploitation. And the first roots of what would later be called trafficking weren't built by criminals. They were built by empires. Priests debated whether coca was divine gift or satanic temptation, but merchants didn't care about theology. They cared about profit. Shipments of coca began moving from South America to Europe, classified as botanical curiosities for scientific study. Universities analyzed it. Doctors experimented with it. And slowly, quietly, the knowledge that belonged to the Andes was stolen, repackaged, and sold back to the world as discovery. The wound left by that theft never healed. Indigenous communities watched their sacred plant become a commodity, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. By the time the 19th century arrived, coca had crossed oceans and entered European laboratories. Scientists isolated its active compounds, fascinated by the stimulant effects they could refine and control. What had once required chewing leaves for hours could now be concentrated into powders, tinctures, extracts. The transformation was happening faster than anyone realized. Coca wasn't just a plant anymore. It was becoming something else entirely, something that couldn't be undone. And the people who'd cultivated it for generations were silenced from the conversation, their voices buried under the weight of so-called progress. The leap from sacred leaf to global commodity took centuries, but once it began, there was no stopping it. Colonial greed opened the door. Scientific curiosity walked through. And what emerged on the other side would reshape economies, destroy lives, and rewrite the rules of power itself. The coca leaf had turned into something far more dangerous than anyone in those Andean villages could have imagined. It had become the raw material for an empire, and in the laboratories of Europe, doctors were about to bottle that empire into medicine. At the turn of the century, European laboratories glowed with amber bottles and elegant labels that promised miracles. Doctors in pressed white coats handled cocaine like it was liquid gold, fascinated by its ability to numb pain and sharpen focus. The pharmaceutical industry had found something revolutionary, a substance that could redefine medicine itself. Cocaine was marketed as the answer to everything from toothaches to depression, from fatigue to surgical procedures. It wasn't hidden in back alleys. It was displayed proudly in pharmacy windows. And the truth about its dangers was deliberately silenced by companies racing to dominate the market. The official story claimed cocaine was adopted purely as a groundbreaking anesthetic, a tool that would transform surgery and patient care. And in some ways, that wasn't entirely wrong. Surgeons used it to perform operations that would have been impossible before. Dentists administered it to patients who feared the chair. But what the glossy advertisements didn't mention was that pharmaceutical companies already knew about the severe risks. Internal memos, later classified and buried, showed executives debating whether to disclose addiction rates. They chose profit over honesty. They chose expansion over ethics. And millions of people paid the price. By the 1890s, cocaine-based products flooded the market. You could buy cocaine lozenges for sore throats, cocaine drops for children's teething pain, cocaine wine for nervous exhaustion. Respected physicians wrote glowing testimonials. Medical journals published studies funded by the very companies selling the product. It was a brilliantly orchestrated operation, one that made addiction look like treatment and dependency look like healing. The fascination with science had opened doors that could never again be closed. And behind those doors, something darker than anyone admitted was taking root. The wound cocaine left on society wasn't immediate. It crept in slowly, disguised as progress. Patients who started using it for legitimate pain found themselves unable to stop. Workers who took it to stay alert through long shifts discovered their bodies demanding more. Families watched loved ones change, their eyes hollowing out, their hands shaking when the supply ran dry. But the pharmaceutical companies didn't pull their products. They didn't issue warnings. They simply reformulated, rebranded, and kept selling. Because as long as the money flowed, the truth could stay buried. What made this era so dangerous wasn't just the substance itself. It was the legitimacy wrapped around it. Cocaine didn't arrive in shadowy deals or whispered transactions. It arrived in doctors' prescriptions and pharmacy counters, stamped with the approval of science and medicine. That respectability erased doubt. It silenced questions. And by the time governments began to understand what they'd unleashed, the damage was already done. The bottles were already open. The addiction was already spreading. And in the streets of cities across Europe and America, a new kind of market was quietly being born. In every sip, there was more than taste. There was a promise that seduced without warning. Urban bars in 1905 buzzed with energy, as glasses clinked beneath seductive posters plastered on brick walls. Cocaine-based tonics and energy drinks lined shelves like any other refreshment, their labels decorated with elegant fonts and health claims that sounded almost scientific. They were marketed as cure-alls, as pick-me-ups for the modern worker, as sophisticated indulgences for those who wanted to feel alive. Nobody called them dangerous. Nobody called them addictive. They were just drinks. And that's exactly what made them so devastating. The official version painted these tonics as simple popular stimulants, products of an optimistic age that believed chemistry could solve every human limitation. But what's been erased from that narrative is how deliberately these companies engineered mass consumption. Advertisements targeted exhausted factory workers, promising them the strength to work longer hours. They targeted housewives, offering relief from the monotony of domestic life. They even targeted children with sweet syrups that masked the bitter taste of cocaine beneath layers of sugar and fruit flavoring. It wasn't accidental, it was strategic, and it worked. What made these drinks so insidious was their normalization. Cocaine wasn't something you sought out in hidden corners. It was something you ordered at lunch. You didn't need a prescription or a dealer. You just needed pocket change and a thirst. The companies behind these products understood something crucial. If you could make a poison feel ordinary, people would consume it without question. And they did. Millions of people across Europe and America drank cocaine daily, believing they were simply staying alert, staying productive, staying modern. The truth about what was happening to their bodies remained carefully hidden. By the early 1900s, these tonics had become woven into the fabric of everyday life. Workers relied on them to survive grueling shifts. Students used them to push through exams. Socialites sipped them at parties, enjoying the rush of confidence and euphoria. But beneath the surface, something was collapsing. People who'd started with 1 glass a day found themselves drinking 3, then 5, then more than they could count. Their hands trembled. Their sleep vanished. Their bodies hollowed out from the inside. Yet the advertisements kept smiling, kept promising, kept lying. The companies knew. Internal documents, only unearthed decades later, revealed that manufacturers were aware of the dependency their products created. They knew customers were becoming addicted. They knew some were dying. But they also knew that addicted customers were loyal customers, and loyalty meant profit. So they didn't pull the drinks from shelves. They didn't issue warnings. They simply kept bottling, kept distributing, kept watching the money roll in. The trivialization of poison, sold as lifestyle, had become one of the most successful operations in commercial history. And the world was about to realize it had a problem too big to swallow. No one noticed, but the world was already changing in the holds of those ships. Clandestine ports in Peru came alive at dawn, where steaming vessels docked under grey skies and crates were loaded with practiced silence. The official story classified these operations as small, isolated smuggling, nothing more than opportunistic criminals moving minor quantities across borders. But that narrative was a lie designed to hide a far more organized truth. By the early 20th century, the first true international trafficking routes were being established, connecting South America to Europe in ways that would reshape the global underworld. And governments knew about it. The ships didn't just carry coca leaves anymore. They carried processed extracts, concentrated powders, refined products, ready for European markets, hungry for the substance. Port officials turned blind eyes as wooden crates marked agricultural samples or medicinal supplies were hauled onto decks. Customs inspectors accepted envelopes stuffed with cash and waved shipments through without inspection. It wasn't chaos, it was coordination. The routes were planned, the schedules precise, the networks growing stronger with every successful delivery. What looked like isolated incidents were actually the building blocks of an empire. The hidden truth behind this operation was simple. Industrial profits made enforcement inconvenient. Pharmaceutical companies, still selling cocaine legally in tonics and medicines, depended on steady supplies from South America. If authorities cracked down too hard on smuggling, legitimate supply chains would collapse. So a quiet agreement emerged, one never written down, never acknowledged, but understood by everyone involved. Law enforcement would make occasional arrests for appearances. Traffickers would operate cautiously but freely, and the money would keep flowing in both directions, legal and illegal blending into one indistinguishable stream. What made these early routes so effective was their simplicity. Traffickers didn't need elaborate schemes or high-tech equipment. They needed corrupt officials, reliable ships, and patience. A captain willing to look the other way, a dock worker who wouldn't ask questions, a banker who'd accept deposits without demanding explanations. The system worked because everyone got paid. The wound this created in international law enforcement never healed. It established a precedent that crime and commerce could coexist, that borders were negotiable, that truth was whatever those in power agreed to call it. By the 1920s, these routes had become so entrenched that dismantling them would have required dismantling entire port economies. Towns in South America depended on the income. European distributors had built empires on the supply. And governments, despite public pronouncements about fighting smuggling, had grown comfortable with the bribes and the silence. Something irreversible was quietly taking shape. A global network that operated in shadows but influenced decisions in the light. The underworld wasn't just being born, it was being legitimized, one shipment at a time. And in the trenches of World War I, that network was about to find its most desperate customers yet. Between mud and blood, a white powder held up men who no longer had strength. The waterlogged trenches of 1917 stretched endlessly across Europe, filled with soldiers whose bodies were breaking under the weight of war. Exhausted men received small stimulant capsules from field medics, told it would keep them alert, keep them fighting, keep them alive just a little longer. The official version claimed it was merely a medical attempt to sustain troops through impossible conditions. But that sanitized narrative erased the darker truth. Cocaine dependence spread through entire armies, sanctioned by the very commanders who sent men into the fire. The capsules arrived in unmarked tins, distributed during night watches and before dawn raids. Soldiers didn't question what they were taking, they just knew it worked. Suddenly the cold didn't bite as hard, the hunger didn't gnaw as deep, the fear didn't paralyze quite so completely. Men who should have collapsed from exhaustion found themselves pushing forward, their hearts racing, their minds buzzing with artificial clarity. It felt like survival, it felt like strength, but it was neither. It was just chemistry keeping corpses on their feet a few hours longer than nature intended. What made this hidden operation so devastating wasn't just the immediate effects. It was the aftermath no one prepared for. When soldiers finally rotated out of the trenches, many discovered they couldn't function without the powder. Their hands shook, their thoughts scattered. Sleep became impossible. Or when it came, it brought nightmares worse than the waking world. Medical officers noticed the pattern, but stayed silent, afraid that acknowledging the problem would undermine morale. So they kept distributing, kept watching men unravel. kept pretending it was all just necessary medicine for necessary wars. The truth buried in classified military reports showed that entire battalions developed dependencies. Some units refused to advance without their supply. Others became so volatile from extended use that they posed dangers to their own side. Commanders knew this. They saw men whose pupils never shrank, whose jaws never stopped grinding, whose paranoia turned fellow soldiers into imagined enemies. But admitting the scale of the problem would have meant admitting that military leadership had chemically broken their own troops. So the reports stayed classified, the wound stayed hidden, and thousands of men returned home carrying addictions no one would acknowledge or treat. What World War I did for cocaine was accelerate its normalization among a generation already traumatized beyond measure. Soldiers who'd relied on it in trenches brought that dependency back to cities and towns across Europe and America. They didn't call it addiction. They called it coping. They called it getting through the day. And as they struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, many found that the only thing that silenced the memories, that quieted the shaking, that made the world feel manageable again, was the same powder that had kept them standing in the mud. The war had created a market, and corporations were already waiting to fill it. Behind every industrial revolution lies a product no one wants to mention. In lamplit offices across Europe and America, executives in tailored suits signed export contracts that would generate fortunes. Cocaine wasn't just a pharmaceutical commodity. It was an economic engine driving corporate expansion at a scale few substances had ever achieved. The official narrative painted it as normal business, a legitimate product meeting legitimate demand. But the hidden truth reveals something far more calculated. Large companies funded research and advertising campaigns specifically designed to keep addiction profitable, to keep dependency growing, to keep the money flowing no matter the human cost. The operation was sophisticated. Pharmaceutical giants hired scientists to produce studies emphasizing cocaine's benefits while downplaying its dangers. They paid doctors to write testimonials praising its therapeutic effects. They crafted advertisements that made cocaine products seem essential for modern life, necessary for productivity, for health, for simply keeping up with the demands of an accelerating world. And it worked. Sales exploded. Factories expanded, stock prices soared. The executives signing those contracts knew exactly what they were selling. They just chose not to care. What made this era particularly insidious was how corporations weaponized respectability. Cocaine products weren't marketed by shadowy dealers. They were marketed by trusted brands with respectable names and polished reputations. Companies positioned themselves as pillars of scientific progress, as benefactors bringing relief to suffering masses. They sponsored medical conferences. They donated to universities. They built libraries and hospitals, all while quietly suppressing internal research, showing that their flagship products were creating epidemics of dependency. The wound this duplicity carved into public trust would take generations to heal. The profits were staggering. Classified financial records, uncovered decades later, showed that some pharmaceutical companies derived more revenue from cocaine products than from all their other offerings combined. Executives received bonuses based on sales volume, creating direct financial incentives to maximize consumption regardless of consequences. Board meetings discussed expansion strategies, new markets, untapped demographics. They talked about cocaine the way other industries talked about steel or cotton, as a resource to be exploited, a commodity to be monetized, a product whose human toll was simply the cost of doing business. By the early 1900s, these corporations had built empires on white powder. They owned factories, controlled supply chains, influenced medical education, and shaped public perception through carefully orchestrated propaganda. They'd turned addiction into an industry. They'd made dependency profitable, and they'd done it all under the banner of healing and progress. But the world was starting to notice the bodies piling up, the lives collapsing, the communities being erased by a substance sold as medicine. And in diplomatic halls across Europe, politicians were beginning to ask dangerous questions that corporations couldn't silence forever. The era of legitimacy was about to collapse. When governments decide what is moral, there is almost always something else between the lines. Diplomatic halls in 1912 echoed with tense voices as representatives from multiple nations gathered at the Hague Convention, stamping papers that would reshape the global legal landscape. The official version claimed the goal was purely to protect public health, to save populations from the ravages of addiction that had become impossible to ignore. But the hidden truth reveals a far more complex web of motivations. Racial prejudices, geopolitical power plays, and economic pressures drove much of the prohibition agenda. Morality was the excuse. Control was the objective. The discussions behind closed doors weren't just about cocaine's dangers. They were about who used it and where it came from. Delegates invoked images of degenerate populations and inferior races succumbing to substances that threatened Western civilization. Chinese immigrants and their opium use became rhetorical weapons. Black communities and cocaine consumption became justifications for harsher enforcement. The language of public health concealed agendas of social control, border management, and racial containment. What was being classified as criminal wasn't just a substance. It was entire communities deemed undesirable by those holding power. The economic motivations were equally cynical. European pharmaceutical companies that had profited enormously from cocaine now faced collapsing markets as addiction became undeniable scandal. Some companies lobbied for prohibition to eliminate competition from unregulated suppliers, hoping to maintain control through medical prescriptions. Others saw an opportunity to pivot to newer, patentable alternatives, while criminalizing the products that had made them wealthy. The convention gave them legal cover to abandon the wreckage they'd created, while positioning themselves as responsible actors supporting reform. The wound of their hypocrisy went unacknowledged. Geopolitically, the convention served strategic interests far beyond health concerns. Controlling coca production meant controlling South American economies. Regulating opium meant leverage over Asian trade routes. The nations pushing hardest for prohibition were often the same ones that had previously profited from drug commerce through colonial enterprises. Now they rebranded exploitation as enlightened policy, presenting themselves as moral authorities while silencing the voices of nations and communities most affected by their decisions. The truth was never about saving lives. It was about consolidating power under the guise of protection. The 1912 convention marked a turning point, but not the one history books celebrate. It didn't end addiction or dismantle trafficking networks. Instead, it drove the trade underground, where it would grow exponentially more violent, more profitable, and more impossible to control. By criminalizing cocaine, governments created the conditions for organized crime to flourish. They handed criminals a monopoly on a product millions still wanted. And in cities across the world, particularly in places like New York, the consequences of that decision were about to manifest in ways no diplomat had anticipated. The law had changed everything, but not in the direction anyone claimed to want. The city breathed danger long before it understood what was coming. Dark alleys in 1970s New York pulsed with transactions happening beneath flickering fluorescent lights, quick exchanges of cash and powder that vanished into the night. The official narrative described this as a spontaneous rise in urban consumption, a cultural shift driven by hedonism and counterculture rebellion. But that explanation erased the systematic failures that made it possible. Institutional corruption, deliberate policy neglect, and law enforcement complicity paved the way for cartels to emerge from the shadows and claim entire neighborhoods as territory. This wasn't spontaneous, it was inevitable. After decades of relative quiet following prohibition, cocaine returned with a vengeance that caught authorities completely unprepared. But the truth is, they weren't unprepared. They were complicit. Police departments knew which corners were being used for deals. Prosecutors knew which officers were accepting payoffs. City officials knew which precincts had become operational partners with traffickers rather than adversaries. The system wasn't failing to stop the trade. The system was participating in it, and every silenced investigation, every buried report, every witness who disappeared before testifying reinforced the collapse happening in real time. What made this era different from earlier periods was the organizational sophistication of the criminal networks. These weren't street-level hustlers making opportunistic sales. These were structured operations with hierarchies, territories, enforcement arms, and financial strategies that rivaled legitimate corporations. Cartels from Colombia and other South American nations identified New York as a critical market and moved in with precision. They established distribution networks, recruited local dealers, eliminated competition through violence, and built empires on street corners that police had effectively abandoned. The wound this inflicted on urban communities is still visible today. The human cost was staggering and disproportionate. While cocaine became the drug of choice in wealthy nightclubs and Wall Street offices, crack cocaine, a cheaper, more addictive form, devastated poor and predominantly black neighborhoods. Families were destroyed. Children grew up surrounded by violence. Entire blocks became open-air markets where hope went to die. And the government response wasn't treatment or intervention. It was mass incarceration, militarized policing, and policies that treated addiction as a moral failure rather than a public health crisis. The hidden truth was that this selective enforcement served political purposes, criminalizing populations while protecting profitable users elsewhere. By the early 1980s, New York had become ground zero for a cocaine epidemic that would spread across America. But calling it an epidemic obscured responsibility. Epidemics are natural disasters. This was manufactured by policy choices, by institutional corruption, by economic abandonment of entire communities. The city had been sick for years, its systems rotting from within, before anyone in power admitted the symptoms. And while headlines screamed about crime waves and moral decay, the real story remained hidden. The collapse wasn't coming from the streets up, it was coming from the top down. And deep in the jungles of South America, the infrastructure feeding that collapse was becoming more sophisticated than anyone imagined. In silence, the jungle began to house factories more efficient than many industrial parks. The humid depths of the Amazon and Andes in the 1980s concealed improvised sheds lit by lanterns, where the air hung thick with chemical fumes and the constant buzz of generators. The official version described these operations as amateur groups, producing small quantities with crude methods. But that narrative was designed to minimize a truth far more alarming. Trained engineers and chemists, some with degrees from prestigious universities, had joined the clandestine circuit, bringing professional expertise to what had been dismissed as primitive crime. The industrialization of cocaine was happening in places governments couldn't reach. The transformation was astonishing. What started as basic coca paste production evolved into sophisticated chemical operations capable of refining hundreds of kilograms weekly. These weren't backyard stills. They were assembly lines. Workers operated in shifts. Quality control specialists tested purity levels. Supply chain managers coordinated the flow of precursor chemicals smuggled in from legitimate pharmaceutical suppliers. The hidden truth was that the technology and methods being used in jungle labs often surpassed what legal industries employed. And the people running these operations understood something crucial. Location was their greatest weapon. Deep in territories where government presence was minimal or non-existent, these labs operated with near impunity. The jungle itself provided cover that no urban operation could match. Helicopter surveillance was useless beneath the canopy. Ground raids required navigating terrain that took days to penetrate. And even when authorities located a lab, destroying it meant nothing. The operators would simply relocate, rebuild, and resume production within weeks. The classified reports that did make it back to intelligence agencies revealed a disturbing pattern. The labs were becoming more mobile, more concealed, and more productive with each passing year. What made this industrialization truly dangerous was the expertise behind it. Former military engineers designed ventilation systems that dispersed chemical odors before they could be detected. University-trained chemists developed new synthesis methods that increased yield and reduced waste. Logistics experts built distribution networks that moved product from jungle to port to international markets with efficiency that would have impressed any Fortune 500 company. This wasn't crime adapting to circumstances. This was crime evolving into an industry, complete with research and development, operational optimization, and strategic planning. The wound these jungle labs carved into international law enforcement was one of helplessness. Governments realized they were facing adversaries with resources, intelligence, and capabilities they couldn't match in remote terrain. Every lab destroyed was replaced by 2 more. Every chemist arrested was succeeded by someone better trained. The operation had become self-sustaining, a hidden empire generating billions while remaining essentially untouchable. And the product being refined in those jungle sheds wasn't staying local. It was being loaded onto planes, flown across borders, and delivered to markets that seemed impossible to reach. But in the sky, traffickers had found the one territory that couldn't be blocked. The sky was the only path that could not be blocked. Small planes took off at dawn from improvised runways carved into remote farms, their engines roaring across landscapes where no authority dared venture. These weren't commercial flights filing paperwork and following regulations. These were ghost aircraft, unregistered and untraceable, carrying loads worth millions across borders that existed only on maps. The official version claimed cartels simply improvised ways to evade authorities, using whatever methods desperation provided. But the hidden truth was far more organized. Some pilots had military training, some had political support networks, and the cocaine air bridge they created revolutionized trafficking in ways that made ground routes obsolete. The operation required precision that rivaled legitimate aviation. Pilots calculated fuel loads, weather patterns, and radar blind spots with expertise that came from years of training, often military training. Many had flown combat missions or worked as commercial aviators before discovering they could make more in one night than in a year of legal work. They knew how to fly low enough to avoid detection, how to navigate using terrain rather than instruments, how to land on strips barely longer than a highway. What looked like reckless criminality was actually calculated risk executed by professionals who understood their craft better than most people understood theirs. The planes themselves told a story authorities didn't want to acknowledge. These weren't rickety crop dusters held together with duct tape. Many were sophisticated aircraft, well maintained and modified for long-range flights. Fuel tanks were expanded, weight was reduced, navigation equipment was upgraded. The investment required to operate this fleet was substantial, suggesting financial backing that went far beyond street-level trafficking. And the classified intelligence reports that tracked these flights revealed patterns of protection. Certain routes were never intercepted, certain airstrips were never raided, certain pilots were never arrested despite being known to authorities. What made the air bridge truly unstoppable was its adaptability. When one route got compromised, operators shifted to another. When one country increased enforcement, flights simply went around it. The network stretched from Colombia to Central America, to Mexico, to the United States, with backup routes through the Caribbean and even across the Atlantic to Africa and Europe. It was a web so complex that cutting one strand only redistributed traffic to others. The truth silenced in official reports was that governments were losing this battle comprehensively. The sky had become a territory of dispute, and the traffickers were winning. The human cost of this aerial operation extended far beyond the drugs being transported. Pilots who flew these routes lived short, brutal lives. Many crashed in jungles and were never found. Others were killed by the very organizations that employed them when they became liabilities. Communities near the airstrips suffered violence as rival groups fought for control of strategic locations. And the cocaine reaching its destinations fueled epidemics that destroyed neighborhoods across continents. Yet the flights continued, night after night, because the profits were too enormous to resist. The loads being flown across borders weren't just cocaine, they were currency. And in the vaults of international banks, that currency was being quietly laundered into legitimacy. Crime only grows when it finds open vaults. Metal vaults in European banks held stacks of freshly washed bills, their serial numbers erased from any traceable history, their origins obscured by layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. The official narrative acknowledged occasional laundering uncovered in major investigations, isolated incidents of corruption that authorities claimed to be addressing. But the hidden truth was far more systemic and devastating. Financial institutions knew the origin of the capital flooding their vaults. They knew it came from cocaine, from suffering, from death. And they accepted it anyway in exchange for million-dollar fees that made morality negotiable. The operation worked because banks built plausible deniability into every transaction. A shell company in Panama deposits cash. Another entity in the Cayman Islands transfers funds. A third corporation in Luxembourg invests in real estate. Each step appeared legitimate in isolation. Each banker involved could claim they'd followed proper protocols, verified documentation, reported suspicious activity when required. But the system itself was designed to facilitate exactly what it claimed to prevent. The classified documents that eventually surfaced showed bank executives discussing how to structure transactions to avoid triggering regulatory scrutiny while maximizing profits from illicit sources. What made this financial complicity so dangerous was its respectability. These weren't shady back-alley operations. These were prestigious institutions with marble lobbies, with centuries of history, with reputations built on trust and stability. When cocaine money entered their systems, it gained legitimacy simply by association. Traffickers could point to their bank statements, their investment portfolios, their corporate holdings as proof of legitimate wealth. The wound this inflicted on global finance was the revelation that corruption wasn't an aberration. It was a feature. The system worked exactly as designed, and what it was designed to do was profit from crime while maintaining plausible ignorance. The scale was staggering. Billions of dollars cycled through international banking systems annually, flowing from street corners in New York and Miami into investment accounts in Geneva and London. Banks competed for this business, offering specialized services to high-net-worth clients who everyone knew had questionable income sources. Private banking divisions created products specifically tailored to conceal wealth origins. Compliance officers learned which questions not to ask, and when investigations did occur, the penalties were always less than the profits. Paying a fine became just another cost of doing business in an industry where silence was literally golden. The truth contained in whistleblower testimonies and leaked documents revealed something even darker. Some institutions didn't just accept dirty money passively, they actively sought it. They sent representatives to meet with cartel leaders. They offered expertise on how to structure transactions to avoid detection. They became operational partners in trafficking organizations, providing financial infrastructure that was essential to the entire enterprise. Without banks willing to launder cocaine profits, the trade couldn't have functioned at the scale it reached. The vaults weren't just holding money, they were holding the entire system together. And while billions flowed through those vaults, cities were collapsing under the weight of what that money represented. Behind the glitter, ruins were slowly being built. Clubs glowing with neon lights pulsed with loud music as mirrors fogged from the movement of bodies and something else. Lines of white powder disappearing into nostrils beneath the strobing chaos. New York in the 1980s became the epicenter of cocaine consumption. A city where the drug wasn't just available but celebrated, woven into the fabric of nightlife and corporate culture alike. The official version blamed hedonism, a generation seeking pleasure without consequences. But that narrative erased the hidden marketing campaigns and celebrity endorsements that indirectly financed cocaine's expansion into mainstream acceptance. The explosion wasn't accidental. It was cultivated. Record labels featured cocaine references in hit songs that dominated radio airwaves. Fashion magazines ran editorials in clubs known for their drug use, making those venues seem glamorous and desirable. Celebrities were photographed at parties where cocaine flowed as freely as champagne. Their images reproduced in tabloids that pretended to condemn while actually advertising. The music, the fashion, the lifestyle, all of it created an ecosystem where cocaine use became aspirational. And the truth was that many of these influencers were being compensated, directly or indirectly, by the very organizations profiting from the trade. What made this era particularly insidious was how cocaine transcended class boundaries in ways previous drugs hadn't. Wall Street traders used it to work 100-hour weeks. Studio executives used it to maintain the pace of film production. Models used it to stay thin. Artists used it to fuel creativity. And street-level dealers supplied all of them, creating distribution networks that connected penthouse apartments to housing project stairwells. The wound this carved through New York was one of false equality. Everyone was using, so it must be okay, but the consequences were never equally distributed. While powder cocaine circulated in boardrooms and nightclubs with relatively little legal consequence, crack cocaine devastated poor neighborhoods with military-style enforcement. The same substance, processed differently, carried wildly different social and legal implications. Wealthy users faced rehab and second chances. Poor users faced prison and permanent records. This selective application of law wasn't accidental, it was policy. And the hidden truth was that allowing cocaine to flourish in certain communities while criminalizing it in others served political purposes, maintaining social hierarchies while generating massive profits for those positioned to benefit from both ends of the market. The cultural damage extended beyond individual addiction. New York's identity became intertwined with cocaine in ways that persisted long after the peak of the epidemic. Songs written about it became classics. Movies depicting that era became nostalgic artifacts. The city's reputation for fast living and dangerous glamour was built partially on a foundation of a drug that killed thousands and destroyed countless families. And while some looked back on the 1980s with fondness, remembering the music and the energy, they conveniently erased the bodies, the overdoses, the neighborhoods that never recovered. The glitter had masked a corrosive void. And while New York slowly confronted its addiction, governments were launching a war they claimed would end trafficking forever, but would only make everything worse. In the name of order, they sowed chaos they could never contain. Military helicopters flew over burned plantations after chemical bombings, their rotors cutting through smoke that rose from fields where coca plants once grew. The official narrative presented this as a hard but necessary strategy, aggressive enforcement to dismantle trafficking at its source. Governments promised that with enough military intervention, enough aerial fumigation, enough interdiction operations, the cocaine trade would collapse. But the hidden truth revealed something far different. These policies didn't weaken cartels. They strengthened them. They didn't save communities. They destroyed local economies and expanded criminal power in ways that made the problem exponentially worse. The war on drugs began with declarations that sounded reasonable: protect children, save neighborhoods, restore order. But the execution was catastrophic. In South America, fumigation campaigns poisoned not just coca, but legitimate crops, water supplies, and ecosystems. Farmers who'd grown coca for generations found themselves with no income and no alternatives. Many had no choice but to work for the very cartels the policies claimed to target. The operations designed to eliminate cocaine production instead created desperate populations that trafficking organizations exploited with brutal efficiency. The wound inflicted on rural communities never healed because the policies that caused it never stopped. Enforcement became increasingly militarized, with special forces conducting raids that looked more like combat operations than police work. Governments, particularly the United States, poured billions into training, equipment, and operations across Latin America. But the classified assessments buried in intelligence archives told a different story than public pronouncements. Year after year, cocaine production increased, purity levels improved, prices dropped, distribution networks expanded. Every metric that should have shown success instead showed failure. Yet the policies continued, not because they worked, but because admitting failure would have meant acknowledging that decades of strategy had been fundamentally wrong. The human cost was staggering and disproportionate. Mass incarceration filled prisons with low-level offenders, while kingpins operated with relative impunity. Mandatory minimum sentences destroyed families for possession amounts that wealthy users consumed recreationally without consequence. Entire neighborhoods were treated as war zones, with militarized police conducting no-knock raids that sometimes killed innocent people. And the truth, silenced in official reports, was that much of this enforcement was racially targeted, criminalizing black and brown communities while treating white suburban use as a health issue requiring treatment rather than punishment. By the 2000s, it was undeniable. The war had been lost before it began. Cartels had grown into multinational organizations with revenues exceeding those of many legitimate corporations. Violence had escalated rather than diminished, with tens of thousands killed in countries where enforcement was most aggressive. And cocaine remained as available as ever, its price adjusted for inflation actually decreasing over decades of supposed crackdown. The controlled hopelessness that settled over policy discussions reflected a truth no one wanted to admit. The war wasn't about winning. It was about maintaining the appearance of action, while the real dynamics of power, money, and control played out in ways governments couldn't acknowledge. And as the 21st century progressed, those dynamics were evolving faster than any policy could address. In the century of speed, even crime learned to evolve faster than the law. Automated ports stretched endlessly beneath floodlights, where containers were scanned through the night in a rhythm that never paused. The official narrative described this as crime simply adapting to the modern world, using new technologies out of necessity. But the hidden truth was far more sophisticated and alarming. Criminal networks were deploying technologies more advanced than many governments possessed. Encrypted communications that intelligence agencies couldn't crack, drone delivery systems, submarine vessels capable of transporting multi-ton loads undetected. The globalization of cocaine had entered an era where the illicit became indistinguishable from the legitimate. The 21st century transformed trafficking from a regional problem into a truly global operation. New routes emerged across Africa, where weak governance and corruption made countries ideal transit points. European markets exploded with demand that South American suppliers eagerly filled. Asian ports became entry points for cocaine, destined for growing markets in Australia and beyond. The web of distribution had become so complex that no single law enforcement operation could meaningfully disrupt it. Take down one route and 3 others compensated. Arrest one trafficker and someone more capable took their place. The system had achieved a kind of immortality through sheer scale and redundancy. What made modern trafficking so effective was its corporate structure. Cartels operated like multinational businesses, with specialized divisions handling production, transportation, distribution, finance, and enforcement. They employed accountants, lawyers, logistics experts, and tech specialists. They conducted market research to identify emerging consumer bases. They invested in infrastructure, ports, airstrips, submarine construction facilities, with budgets that rivaled legitimate industrial projects. The truth classified in intelligence reports showed organizations using artificial intelligence to optimize routes, blockchain technology to launder money, and encrypted networks that made traditional surveillance obsolete. The technology gap between traffickers and law enforcement had become a chasm. While governments debated budgets and navigated bureaucracy, criminal organizations moved with the speed and flexibility of the most innovative tech startups. They recruited talent by offering salaries that government positions couldn't match. They tested new methods in real time, learning from failures and scaling successes with ruthless efficiency. The wound this inflicted on international law enforcement was the realization that they weren't just losing. They were becoming increasingly irrelevant. The methods that worked in previous decades were useless against adversaries who'd entered the digital age, while governments were still filing paperwork. The dark fascination of this era was watching crime modernize faster than society could comprehend. Cocaine was being ordered through encrypted apps and delivered like food service. Payments were made in cryptocurrency that left no traditional paper trail. Distribution networks used facial recognition and AI to identify undercover officers. And the product itself kept evolving: higher purity, new forms, synthetic variants that skirted existing laws. The market never slept because it operated across time zones, coordinated globally, adapting to enforcement faster than enforcement could adapt to it. And while this technological arms race escalated, the cocaine trade's influence was reaching even deeper into the structures of power itself, shaping not just markets, but politics, elections, and the decisions of entire nations. Some decisions that define nations are born in rooms where truth never enters. Luxurious offices with polished wood and leather chairs witness discreet suitcases being exchanged behind closed doors, their contents never appearing in any official ledger. The official version acknowledged isolated cases of political corruption, individual politicians succumbing to temptation in moments of weakness. But the hidden truth was far more systematic and terrifying. Cocaine money didn't just corrupt individuals, it corrupted entire systems. Campaign financing, coups, elections, and governmental decisions were powered by illicit capital in ways that fundamentally shaped the trajectory of nations. And most of it remained carefully erased from public knowledge. The operation worked because everyone involved understood the rules of silence. Traffickers needed political protection, customs officials who'd look away, judges who'd dismiss cases, military commanders who'd redirect enforcement away from key routes. Politicians needed campaign funds that couldn't be traced to sources that would scandalize voters, so deals were made in classified meetings that left no paper trail. Money flowed from cartel accountants through shell companies into political action committees. And in return, policies were shaped, appointments were made, and entire law enforcement strategies were designed with deliberate blind spots that allowed trafficking to flourish. What made this political infiltration so devastating was its scope. It wasn't just local mayors in border towns accepting bribes. It was senators, governors, presidents, leaders at the highest levels of government operating as de facto partners with criminal organizations. In some countries, the line between state and cartel became so blurred it effectively disappeared. Intelligence agencies discovered that they couldn't share certain information with foreign counterparts because those governments were compromised at levels that made operational security impossible. The wound this created in international relations was one of profound distrust. How do you cooperate on enforcement when you can't be certain your partner isn't working for the enemy? The influence extended beyond direct corruption into policy-making itself. Trade agreements were negotiated with considerations about how they'd affect trafficking routes. Military aid packages included clauses that strategically benefited certain organizations while targeting their competitors. Economic sanctions were leveraged not just for stated diplomatic purposes, but to reshape criminal markets in ways that served particular interests. The truth silenced in diplomatic cables and classified briefings was that cocaine had become a geopolitical tool, a form of soft power that rival nations used to destabilize each other while enriching themselves through the chaos. The institutional shadow cast by this infiltration was the realization that democracy itself could be purchased. Electoral outcomes in multiple countries were determined not by the will of voters, but by which candidate received the most cartel funding. Policy decisions affecting millions were made in service of protecting trafficking operations worth billions. And the people, the citizens who believed they lived in functioning democracies with accountable governments, remained deliberately kept in the dark. The powder that had started as a leaf in the Andes had transformed into something far more dangerous than any drug. It had become a force that shaped power itself, invisible but omnipresent, corrupting everything it touched. And there was no clear path to undoing what had been so thoroughly, so systematically embedded into the foundations of modern governance. The leaf is still growing in those same mountains. The laboratories are still running in those same jungles. The money is still flowing through those same vaults. And the decisions that shape nations are still being made in rooms where truth is never invited. History likes to pretend that problems have endings, that wars get won, that systems eventually correct themselves. But cocaine's story doesn't end. It evolves. It adapts. It finds new routes when old ones close, new markets when old ones collapse, new protectors when old ones fall. The powder changed the world, not because it was powerful, but because the world was already broken enough to let it in. What's been erased from the official narrative isn't just the facts, it's the accountability. The pharmaceutical executives who knew and profited anyway, the bankers who laundered with open eyes, the politicians who took the money and made the deals, the systems that were designed not to fail, but to profit from failure. They're still there, still operating, still protected by the same silence that let this empire grow in the first place. The truth is, cocaine didn't create the corruption. It just made it visible to anyone willing to look. And most people, they still aren't looking. Power doesn't corrupt. It just reveals who was already willing to be bought. And the price? It was always cheaper than anyone wants to admit.